So as we get back into our long-form character discussions and the return of Marvel Request Monday, I had jumped on Periscope asking which character people would be interested in seeing, and the Punisher was by and large the popular choice. Now because Marvel Request Monday is a day where I hand my channel over to you guys to determine the videos regarding Marvel characters, this week we're going to be talking about Frank Castle. And so the Punisher first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 129 in 1974 and was created by Gerry Conway with contributions from Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. that actually comes as fallout from the death of Gwen Stacy storyline. What I mean here is that following the night Gwen Stacy died story in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 121 and issue number 122, Peter had sought his revenge against the Green Goblin in a state of rage, and when the battle between the two took place, Peter had intended to kill Osborn but backed off at the last minute. However, using his remote control glider, Osborn had intended to kill Peter by impaling him, but when Parker dodged at the last minute, Osborn was seemingly killed by his own attack. Now where Osborn would eventually return to the Marvel landscape with the revelation that he had simply been regenerating, the fact remains that during this time of the story, the city of New York is under the belief that Peter had killed Osborn. As such, he's not really considered a vigilante and instead operates on kind of a strict leash regarding what it is that he can and can't do. Now regarding the creation of the Punisher, because Gerry Conway's story of the night Gwen Stacy died had catapulted him to the level of superstar status among comic writers, his success had placed him in a position where he wrote for both DC and Marvel. As such, the workload he endured was massive in scale, but in order to ensure that his creations were fleshed out appropriately, Conway often provided primitive designs of what he wanted his characters to look like. To this end, during an interview as part of Comic Reporter's article titled Spider-Man at 50, Conway had stated that the Punisher was originally designed with a small white skull on his left breast, with John Romita Sr. expanding the design to the full scope of Punisher's chest. In addition to this, Conway had originally wanted Punisher to be referred to as the Assassin, but because Stan Lee didn't see a comic succeeding with that line of thought due to the fact that it limited the character's role within the Marvel landscape, the name was changed to Punisher, which provided a connotation that would allow for Castle to switch between the role of a villain and a traditional hero, but also walk the line between both as an anti-hero. Now in his first appearance, Frank Castle simply showed up with no backstory provided regarding his character. Instead, Punisher's first appearance came with the introduction of a villain called the Jackal. While Miles Warren had made his debut previously with Amazing Spider-Man number 31 in 1965, his role was largely supportive in that he had affections for Gwen Stacy but never acted on them. Instead, following her death at the hands of the Green Goblin in Spider-Man, Warren came to believe that Peter was responsible, leading to him undertaking his villainous mantle of the Jackal and seeking revenge. However, regarding the Punisher, his appearance here doesn't come with any context, suffice it to say that he's simply working with the Jackal, although his motives at the moment remain unknown. And so transitioning to Peter, this portion of the story serves to segue into his everyday life in battling criminals, but also gives us some perspective of his life with Gwen Stacy having died, coupled with how the world views him. Because this point in Peter's career still sees him funding his life by way of taking pictures of himself battling villains and selling them to Jameson, where he is successful in apprehending the thieves and ending their scheme, the death of Green Goblin still takes center stage, and that the city as a whole views Peter as a murderer. Now again, we know this isn't the case, and that Osborn died by his own hands, but because the Green Goblin was a villain and had committed multiple heinous acts, the city didn't really mourn his loss, and I would argue that under the surface, celebrated the loss of Norman. But at the same time, the citizens of New York weren't really ready for one of their most celebrated heroes to become a perceived murderer. At this point, we follow Peter to the Daily Bugle as he turns his pictures over to J. Jonah Jameson, at which point he gains his first exposure to the Punisher. However, rather than their first encounter being a battle, the Punisher is introduced by way of Jameson, who has taken an interest in the vigilante. Now because the only available news on Castle comes from the New York Star, a rival newspaper of the Daily Bugle, the goal of Jameson is to have Peter snag pictures of the Punisher in order to ensure that the Bugle stays relevant among newspaper publishers. To this end, as Peter makes his way through New York as Spider-Man, his spider sense begins to tingle, with the Punisher simultaneously taking aim with the intention of killing Parker. Dodging the shot at the last minute, we learn that Punisher's attack came in the form of a concussive projectile designed to incinerate Peter. Traveling to its source, what Marvel does here is establish Punisher as somewhat extremely capable in terms of his use of weapons and martial arts, but also functioning under the same mindset as most of New York's citizenry. Where Peter's attempt to apprehend the Punisher leads him to believe that Castle is trying to escape, the truth is revealed when Castle grabs a gun capable of shooting titanium alloy wiring strong enough to ensnare Peter, even if only temporarily. In addition to this, the words of Frank Castle indicate that he's under the impression that Peter is indeed a murderer, making the case that he exists to fight and kill criminals wherever he finds them, Like the citizens of New York, the Punisher believes Peter to be a killer and intends to eliminate him. However, the mistake the Castle makes here is underestimating Peter's strength and that he fails to realize how strong Peter truly is. What I mean here is that the titanium wiring was strong enough to hold 10 men and immobilize them, but because Peter's strength is well beyond that, he's easily able to break free and battle Castle. During this time, we also learn that Jackal has been monitoring the fight between Spider-Man and Punisher. However, Jackal looks to keep his identity hidden while simultaneously ensuring that Punisher is successful, due to the fact that if Peter gains the upper hand, Punisher may reveal the existence of Warren as the Jackal, with Peter deducing the fact they've all been tricked. As such, Warren steps in and incapacitates Peter from behind using his electrically charged claws, allowing both Jackal and Punisher the chance to escape, with both believing that Peter had died during the fall from the building. Now, what Marvel does here is tell us that neither Punisher nor Warren know the full extent of Peter's abilities, and that Parker's able to block out the pain of Jackal's attack and use his webbing to cling to a ledge and slow his momentum by swinging into a building. Now, the reason why Punisher and Warren know so little about his character is that Castle is presumed to have only recently appeared on the scene in Marvel Comics, and Warren had effectively been hidden away from the world while developing his Jackal persona. As a result, both men only knew of Spider-Man's capabilities by way of whatever reports they happened to come across, as well as Jameson's articles in the Daily Bugle. And so with both men believing Peter's dead, they vacate the scene, leaving their various weapons and armament behind, which Peter uses as clues to determine the true identities of his attackers and why they're pursuing him. Now, following Peter's investigation of these clues, the story also sets the stage for Harry Osborn undertaking the Green Goblin mantle. While this really isn't a relevant part of our discussion, at the very least, it goes to establishing a more well-rounded discussion of the story. Because the death of Norman sent Osborn Industries into disarray leading to bankruptcy, this combined with Harry's breakup to Mary Jane Watson led to a mental breakdown, pushing him over the limit and eventually leading him to undertaking the Green Goblin mantle. But for the purposes of this video, we shift our focus back to the Punisher and Jackal. Now, what Conway does here is establish that Castle isn't necessarily a killer for hire and instead has his own code of honor. This particular bit is of significance since this will become a mainstay of his character for the duration of his role in Marvel Comics. But for Castle, killing Peter Parker isn't about revenge and instead is part of his overarching goal to eliminate the criminal element of New York as a whole. As such, the Punisher begins to question his partnership with Jackal as the fundamental difference between their motives regarding the death of Peter comes down to the levels of honor that the two hold. Having said that, the roads of Peter and Castle eventually meet, as the two both set out to meet a man called the Mechanic. To sidetrack for a second, the Mechanic was a man named Rice, but he has an extremely minor role within the realm of Marvel Comics. Where writer Archie Goodwin would flesh out Rice's backstory during Marvel Super Action No. 1 in 1976 as the former ordnance man of Frank Castle during the Vietnam War, within the context of this story from Spider-Man, when both Peter Parker and Punisher arrive to the Mechanic's base of operations, Peter discovers that he's dead at the same time that Castle arrives. The result is that Castle comes to the belief that Peter had killed Rice, leading to another battle between the two. Now, during their fight, Peter attempts to reason with Punisher by pointing out the damage on Rice's neck and the fact that he was killed by Jackal. However, because Castle refuses to listen and is hell-bent on the idea that Peter is a murderer and needs to be killed, Parker is met with no other choice but to knock Castle out. And so with Punisher coming to a few minutes later, Peter's able to talk reason into him, with Punisher coming to the realization that Jackal had killed his friend and ally. As such, as the story comes to a close, the Punisher and Spider-Man don't really become allies, so much as Punisher abandons his attempt to kill Peter and instead turns his attention to Jackal. Now, following his first appearance and while looking to the newly established Marvel Preview series, which was designed to showcase heroic adventure, science fiction, and sword and sorcery content, Marvel hoped to capitalize on the introduction of Castle by creating a backstory that fed into his anti-hero qualities that fans enjoyed, while making him relatable and engender some measure of sympathy among readers. And so under Jerry Conway and artist Tony DeZunia, in 1975, the first origin of Frank Castle was established in the Marvel Universe. In this story, the Punisher continues his quest of killing various villains within the Marvel Universe, but his backstory is provided by way of the efforts of a man named Chief Inspector Hamilton. After acquiring the dossier on Frank Castle from the United States Marine Corps as part of his attempt to track Castle down and stop his madness, we learn that the name Punisher is actually derived from the media, which began calling Frank Castle by that name due to his perceived punishment of criminals who would otherwise escape the justice system. In addition to this, Castle had served in the Vietnam War for 2 tours, during which time he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award in the military, and provided to soldiers for going above and beyond the call of duty, the Bronze Star for heroic achievement, the Silver Star for valor, and the Purple Heart on 4 different occasions for sustained injuries during battle, all of which goes towards illustrating that Frank Castle had a gift for success in combat. In addition to this, Castle was slated to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is given to civilians for cultural or other significant public or private endeavors, but it disappeared before this could happen. The reasoning is revealed when we learn that sometime following his service in the military, Frank Castle and his family had been caught in the crossfire between two rival mobs. Because Castle's family were considered witnesses, the mob had killed his wife and children. While Frank was shot, the mob had believed him dead and in doing so, left the scene with no one left to verify what had happened. However, because Frank survived but discovered that his family had been slaughtered, his mind snapped, and in the process, he waged a war against all criminals everywhere, vowing to kill them, regardless of their reasons and motivations. So following his first appearance in Marvel Comics as well as his publication of his origin, Punisher became an instant hit and was an example of a character who was in the right place at the right time. What I mean here is that the Punisher was introduced as a ground-level anti-hero, but also had a backstory mired in tragedy that provided reasoning behind his actions. And so between February of 1975 and October of 1983, Castle appeared in 20 separate comics, including a return in Amazing Spider-Man issues 134 and 135, followed up with issues 161, 162, 174, and 175. In addition to Giant-Size Spider-Man number 4, Captain America number 241, Daredevil issues 182 through 184, and Spectacular Spider-Man issues 81 through 83. Furthermore, because his appearances were in the cream of the crop regarding Marvel's popular titles, in January 1986, after 12 years of guest appearances in various publications, Punisher received his first solo series with a 5-issue run titled Circle of Blood. Written by Steve Grant and misprinted as a 4-issue series, The Circle of Blood was a groundbreaking story within the comic book industry. What I mean here is that while the death of Gwen Stacy did see the incorporation of sidekicks and love interests dying, in the end, Marvel was still very much in the business of providing content deemed family-friendly or at the very least, appropriate for older children. As such, during the years of Frank Miller's Daredevil, which pushed the limits of acceptability by incorporating references to off-panel drug use and pornography, Marvel was unwilling to throw the baby out with the bathwater and provide stories depicting or referencing suicide, sexual intercourse, and the death of children. However, in the minds of writer Steve Grant and artist Mike Zeck, The Punisher was a rare opportunity for Marvel to break the mold and try something new. The reason why was because Castle's increased rise in popularity by way of Frank Miller's landmark Child's Play storyline with Daredevil issues 182 through 184, which saw the death of Elektra, meant that the Punisher stood in a murky area and, whether by Marvel's intention or not, had the potential to usher in stories providing content much darker than what had been seen before. Indeed, the transition of real-world society from the lighter days of the 1960s into the darker days of the 1980s by way of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Second Wave Feminist Movement meant that people were ready to see more realistic and gritty content. In addition to this, Chris Claremont had already built on Frank Miller's idea of edgier concepts by incorporating real-world elements into his X-Men stories, like 1982's God Loves, Man Kills, which used the N-word. And so to Grant and Zeck, if the Punisher were to succeed as a viable title with Marvel Comics instead of falling into the realm of obscurity or else being turned into a run-of-the-mill hero, Marvel needed to allow Grant and Zeck to throw everything against the wall and let fans determine what was deemed socially acceptable. As a result, Marvel, Grant, and Zeck found a middle ground, with the duo being allowed to create the content they were looking for, while Marvel released the comic without any advertisement of its existence, allowing the company to remove it from circulation without drawing attention if fan reception was overly negative. Centering on Castle being released from Rikers Island prison and into the custody of a group called The Trust, which was composed of a group of everyday people and modeled after Castle's ideology of bringing vigilante punishment to criminals, The Trust differed in that they incorporated the brainwashing of other criminals into carrying out their vigilante murders. However, because the personal code of Castle decrees the elimination of all criminals while sparing the innocent, the philosophy of The Trust in working with criminals, albeit through brainwashing, led him to come into direct conflict with the group. Using Daredevil Born Again as a basis in that the Kingpin existed as the king of crime in Hell's Kitchen, but whose reputation was destroyed, Frank Castle had lied to reporter Ben Urich by stating that he had killed Wilson Fisk. As a result, the entire criminal underworld fell into a state of civil war, with various gangs and factions looking to fill the void left by the perceived death of Kingpin and consolidate the remaining power unto themselves. While this did achieve the result that Castle was looking for in that he could sit back and quite literally allow the criminals to kill themselves, at the same time, it also presented the issue of innocent people dying in the crossfire. And so after weighing the two options and determining that allowing criminals to exist and killing them piecemeal was a better alternative to risking the lives of innocents in their civil war, Castle brings a conflict to an end and eliminates The Trust before going back into his life of killing villains. Now, where Marvel had expressed concern over the tastefulness of the story and that issue number 3 saw the death of an innocent young girl, and issue number 2 indicated that the Punisher had engaged in intercourse with a woman named Angela, these concerns were assuaged when the story received critical acclaim and is widely considered to be one of Punisher's best stories, behind 2003's Born and 2004's In the Beginning. As a result, the following year, in July of 1987, Marvel launched an ongoing Punisher series under writer Mike Baron. As a fledgling writer at the time providing content for DC with the first 14 issues of Wally West as The Flash coming out of Crisis on Infinite Earths in June of 1987, Mike Baron's early run on Punisher was extremely well received in that while it lacked the borderline content of Grant and Zek's miniseries, it continued the anti-hero status of Punisher while maintaining Castle's violent methods of interrogating and killing criminals. Where Baron had remained writer of the series up until issue number 62 in 1992, the popularity of stories like the 6-part Jigsaw puzzle led to the introduction of the 1988 and 1992 branch-off series titled Punisher War Journal and Punisher Warzone respectively, both of which ran until their cancellations in 1995. Furthermore, between 1993 and 1994, in addition to Volume 2, Warzone and War Journal, Castle was depicted in 3 multi-part annual specials, 5 one-shots, 4 limited series, and 5 crossovers with Archie, Spider-Man, Batman, as well as Ghost Rider and Wolverine. Now, with Baron leaving the series after issue number 62, writer Chuck Dixon was brought on board with issue number 63's Face Off and continued many of the themes from both Grant and Baron's runs with the character. Because Dixon's handling of Castle continued to move the title in an upward direction regarding sales and popularity, albeit among the limited fan base, where his run on Volume 2 was short-lived, this was due to Marvel moving him over to launch Warzone, with Steve Grant, Dan Abnett, and others taking over the writing chores for the remainder of Volume 2. However, by 1995, where the Punisher was wildly popular among his smaller fan base and had seen successful one-shot comics like Punisher Kills the Marvel Universe, his ongoing series had never achieved the same level of success as titles like Spider-Man, the X-Men, or even Captain America. As a result, in the same year, Marvel canceled Volume 2, Warzone and War Journal, and underwriter Dan Abnett released the 4-part series The Punisher Year 1, which served as an unofficial reboot and focused on the backstory of his character and Castle's road to undertaking the Punisher mantle. Now, because the series sold so well, Marvel looked to testing the waters with another ongoing series simply titled Punisher, and underwriter John Ostrander hoped to provide a fresh take on the character and revitalize interest following the slump in sales, which had resulted in the previous series' cancellation. In the end, though, the attempt failed, and after 18 issues, the line was cancelled. And so between 1996 and 1999, The Punisher was resigned to several miniseries and guest appearances in Marvel Comics, including a 4-part Marvel Knights story titled Purgatory, which has been widely ridiculed by fans and critics alike for its poor storytelling, as well as 1999's crossover with Wolverine titled Revelation. So because of his slump in popularity and lack of sales, Marvel hadn't quite given up hope on the Punisher, but his character was viewed as kind of a no man's land and jumping off platform for writers looking to move on to bigger and better things. During this time, and after writing for DC's Constantine within the pages of Hellblazer, in 2000, Garth Ennis had been hired by Marvel editor-in-chief Joe Quesada to take over the Punisher series. Beginning his run with a 12-issue story arc titled Welcome Back Frank, alongside Steve Dillon and Jimmy Palmiotti, Garth Ennis sought to effectively reboot the entire series and start over from scratch. Returning to the roots of Steve Grant and Mike Zeck's miniseries which had made the character so popular, the Welcome Back Frank story saw Punisher returning to New York after a leave of absence and cutting a swath through the criminal underworld. Considered by many to be one of the best Punisher stories of all time, Welcome Back Frank revitalized interest in Castle's character, and in 2001, the series was relaunched with Volume 4 under Ennis and Dillon as part of the Marvel Knights imprint. Now, with Marvel Knights The Punisher only lasting for about 37 issues, the cancellation of the series did not come out of poor reception for the character, but actually came out of how well the title was received. For fans of the Punisher as well as both Ennis and Dillon themselves, the reason why the Punisher had never succeeded in Marvel Comics was because of the fact that the type of content necessary for his success was contingent on being able to provide grittier stories that weren't seen in the main Marvel lineup. In truth, the Grant Zek miniseries was ahead of its time and still considered to be one of the best stories. But in order for Frank Castle to truly come into his own, Marvel needed a way to provide stories on his character that weren't bound by the restrictions of age-appropriate material. And so, looking to the success of Brian Michael Bendis' Alias series and the introduction of Jessica Jones, in March of 2004, Marvel rolled the Punisher over into a standalone series of stories geared towards adult readers, renaming the comic to Punisher Max. During his time as writer and with Louis LaRosa replacing Steve Dillon as artist, the Punisher Max line of comics has become the definitive line of Punisher stories due to the heavy emphasis on character development and simultaneous focus on the darker side of the comic book universe. Because Ennis preferred to tell stories isolated from the superpowered antics of individuals like the Incredible Hulk or the Cosmic Opera, and instead preferred street-level stories with a real-world edge, his writing style flourished with moments like issue number 21's monologue regarding Castle's temptation to kill innocents, along with the guilty, standing out as some of the most memorable quotes. This, combined with stories like the 6-part Slavers arc dealing with human trafficking, meant that Frank Castle had quite literally found a solid home for himself with a hardcore reader base. At the same time, and in 2006 under writer Matt Fraction, Marvel reintroduced the Punisher War Journal Volume 2 to coincide with Civil War, in an effort to beef up the continuing popularity of the Max imprint sales. However, by 2008, Garth Ennis had departed the Punisher Max line to help Marvel launch a reincarnation of the Phantom Eagle from the 1970s War's Hell stories. Looking to the positive reception of Matt Fraction's writing due to War Journal and the possibility of releasing another solo series outside of Marvel Max, the War Journal line was renamed to Punisher, with Rick Remender taking control of the title. Where issues 1 through 10 and Punisher Annual Number 1 served to provide Frank Castle's perspective in the post-Civil War and Secret Invasion lead-up to Dark Reign, which saw Norman Osborn taking over S.H.I.E.L.D. following Stark's ousting in disgrace, Remender had wrote a one-shot titled The List, which saw Punisher facing off against Wolverine's son Daken and dying in the process. Following this, issues 11 through 21 saw Frank Castle return as a Frankenstein-like monster fighting on behalf of Marvel's underworld monsters against an army of samurai. While the post-Dark Reign stories were largely considered silly, fans viewed the concept as a well-received break from Marvel's constant attempts to re-energize interest in a method of storytelling that had long since become uninteresting. However, this reprieve proved itself to be brief when the end of Frankencastle saw Punisher return to his normal human self, after which the series was relaunched yet again under the writing of Greg Rucka. Having previously worked alongside Jeff Johns and Judd Winnick during the Countdown to Infinite Crisis, as well as DC's 52 alongside Grant Morrison and Mark Waid, Greg Rucka was brought in as writer for the Punisher series due to Rick Remender departing in order to launch Uncanny X-Force. While Rucka's run of Punisher received strong reviews for its return to focusing almost exclusively on Castle and away from the actions of other superheroes in the Marvel Universe, like so many writers before him, Rucka was unable to reinvigorate enough interest in the series to keep fans intrigued, resulting in the series cancellation in 2012 after only 16 issues. And so with Marvel laying the groundwork for their Secret Wars event by way of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, under Nathan Edmondson, The Punisher was relaunched with Volume 9 in 2014. Moving Frank Castle out of New York and sending him to Los Angeles, the intention of Marvel was not to create an ongoing series, but instead set the stage for setting the character of Frank Castle out on a high note, and that when the final incursion took place between Earth-616 and the Ultimate Universe, the Punisher was finally able to see his goal of killing all criminals by quite literally entering the Kingpins into the World Celebration and slaughtering everyone. And so with Marvel relaunching their continuity with all new, all different Marvel post-Secret Wars, while we have not seen a title regarding the Punisher character or his introduction into this new universe, because Jon Bernthal will be appearing in Daredevil Season 2 as the Punisher, it stands to reason that most likely we'll see his return in some manner, even if only in a mini-series format. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and let me know down in the comments section which character you want to see from Marvel Comics next week, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.